Hello friends, and welcome back to the channel. Today we are going to debut a new segment, if you will. It's Whiskey 101. I'm going to break down some of the most basic concepts in whiskey. If you're new to the experience, this might be very helpful to you to understand some of the terminology in a world that can be a little bit convoluted if you don't know where to start. And today we're talking about bourbon. It's Whiskey 101 Bourbon Edition. I do plan on getting some kind of cheesy little intro or theme song for the Whiskey 101 series, but I don't have one yet. So imagine in your mind somewhere a cheesy theme song, something like Whiskey 101 with Josh, something like that, something really stupid. That'll go right about here. Today, let's talk about bourbon. Now, what makes bourbon bourbon? What differentiates bourbon from other types of whiskey? That's what we're going to talk about. We'll also talk a little bit about some of the characteristics that's pretty common across bourbon. And lastly, we will bust the number one most insidious myth around bourbon. But first, let's start with the basics. What is required to call yourself a bourbon? First things first, the mash bill. The mash bill of a bourbon must be 51% corn. So all whiskey is made from fermented grains and at various levels, various different types of grains. That is what gives you your mash bill. To be bourbon, that mash bill must just start with 51% corn. So that is number one, 51% corn on the mash bill. Number two, the second thing you need to call yourself a bourbon is you must be aged in new charred oak barrels for at least 2 years. All sorts of barrels are used across all sorts of whiskeys, but to be a bourbon, you gotta age for at least 2 years in those new charred oak barrels. Super important. And finally, let's talk about ABV, alcohol by volume. Now, this is where things can get a little bit technical. The bourbon ABV requirements are as follows. The mash must be distilled at 160 proof or less. It is then aged in barrels until it is no more than 125 proof. Now, the third step is it is diluted and distilled before bottling down to no less than 80 proof or 40% alcohol by volume. If you want to know your ABV, just have your proof number. So that's the requirement. It gets a little technical, I know, but luckily you don't really have to think about those things because if it says bourbon, it's going to have hit those requirements. Now let's bust that number one myth about bourbon. That number one myth is bourbon must come from Kentucky. You might have even heard a more aggressive version of this myth that bourbon must come from Bourbon County, Kentucky. False. It's totally false. Bourbon doesn't have to come from Kentucky, but the funny part is it likely does. Now, to be called Kentucky straight bourbon, it does need to come from Kentucky. But next time you're at the bar and you got that guy saying, bourbon only comes from one place in Kentucky, that guy is drunk and he might be a lot of fun. If you can buy him one or two more rounds, you can get some cool stories from Nam. But yeah, he's just not right. I'm sorry. Those requirements that I hit before, the mash bill, the barrels, and the alcohol by volume requirements, that's all you need. That's what makes it bourbon, not where it comes from, although most bourbon actually does come from Kentucky, and that region has become synonymous with the idea of bourbon. So we've got a smattering here in front of us, all of which are absolutely bourbon. I've got Henry McKenna single barrel bottled in bond. Now this is Kentucky straight bourbon. It's also bottled in bond, and that is a very specific government designation, which I'll actually get into later in another Whiskey 101 video. So guess what? Bourbon, right? We've also got Wild Turkey Rare Breed. This is another Kentucky straight bourbon, so it does come from Kentucky. Also bourbon, but very different in the taste and characteristics of these two liquors. Now I've also got Elijah Craig's small batch here, a great bottle for the price. Another Kentucky straight bourbon whiskey, tastes very different than these two, also still bourbon. You got it. So now you're a little bit more informed, you're a little bit more aware of what bourbon actually is, and I hope this helped. We got a lot more of these Whiskey 101 videos coming your way, along with a super cheesy theme song that I'm really excited to get somebody to make for me. I'm a little too excited for that, I think, but it'll be fun. So thank you very much. If it's your first time here, you might want to go a little south and hit that like, maybe even a subscribe for me. That would be super cool. And ring that bell so you know when more videos are coming your way. Thank you so much. See you on the next one.